We have two extremely erudite and eminent experts, and they come from two completely separate areas, but somehow their twains do meet as far as national security and Indian security go. General Hasnain has not just been a corps commander in Srinagar, but he's served virtually at every rank in Jammu and Kashmir, from the rank of a major to a rank of a lieutenant general, which is a wealth of experience. I said, sir, considering that Kashmir is very much in the news, and you write prolifically, I think it's time you put out a bestseller also. And Professor Harsh Pant, again, a rare combination of an Indian academic who's a professor at the War Studies Department at King's College London, of which we are all alumnus, by the way. And Professor Harsh Pant is also Director of Studies and Research at the ORF. And he so frequently sends me links to his essays that I must admit I can't read all of them. But having said all that, so I can assure you, you are in for some extremely informed opinions on a number of issues. Since 370 was the start point for this, you know, in my view, the security situation or India's neighborhood or the geopolitics of the region was pretty volatile even before the initiative to set 370 aside was taken up by the government. And this is something that saw not just our hostile neighbors, that is China and Pakistan, ganging up against us once again publicly, most visibly at the United Nations Security Council, where they tried their best to try and get some kind of a censor against India. But they have been working towards, in a number of ways, to unsettle India and to distract us from the bigger agenda of economic growth. So I'll ask Professor Pant to initially enlighten us about the various trends in geopolitics that have been taking place over the last couple of years. And August 5th was just another point of time in history, much as many others would say that India has probably taken steps where India can't go back on, but India has also taken steps which has left particularly Pakistan and China completely in a flux. There are all kind of chest-thumping bravado type statements coming out, but the reality is that quite clearly it's taken everybody by surprise. But before 370, what is it that led us onto taking this position? Why did the situation come to what it is? Was it that it was just an election promise? Was it because we felt that we needed to go beyond the established narrative? The map, please, the map of Asia.
Well, thank you, Maruf, and thanks for having me here. I think what the larger geopolitics of the region has been evolving quite rapidly. And China's rise, I think in particular, has challenged some of our earlier assumptions about how we view the region, how we view South Asia, and I think how we view traditional geographies. So today, when you talk of the larger geopolitical reality around India, you are looking at the larger Indo-Pacific down south, you are looking at the larger Eurasian construct up north. And I think what that has done is to push India in directions where perhaps Indian strategists, Indian policymakers were not willing to go before. And that in particular, and if you see how you talked about China and Pakistan colluding with each other in the UN post-Article 370 decision by India, but even if you go before what was happening before Article 370, I think China, in its desire to reshape its strategic periphery, had ended up in a state of collusion with Pakistan that is quite unprecedented. We all knew China and Pakistan are very close allies, they are very close partners, but I think once Belt and Road Initiative came into being, and once you have the entire China-Pakistan economic corridor reshaping India's strategic periphery, the questions, I think, for Indian policymakers were profound as to what can they possibly realistically do to not only preserve their own interests, preserve their own viability within territorial viability, within their with the parts of the Kashmir that they controlled, but also to put the ball back in Pakistan's court. Not simply to, you don't want to be perpetually in a position where you are answering the charges that Pakistan is raising. Increasingly, China also siding with Pakistan. You also want to be able to push Pakistan to decide its own course vis-a-vis India. And I think that, with the Article 370 decision, I think that has been a terrific change and a tremendous change, where increasingly it's now Pakistan that is almost flailing. And the decision by India has almost left it bereft of any ideological narrative. And therefore, for once, India is in the driving seat insofar as the narrative is concerned, insofar as its trade boundaries are concerned. And I think that will have a significant implication for how not only Sino-Pakistan relationship evolves, as we have seen with...
Yeah, I want to go now into the Pakistan factor. And I want to address two things. And General Hasnain, sir, you'll be well placed to do that, because this conclave has a very specific economic expertise level. We need to understand what is it that keeps Pakistan hooked to China. What is the financial cost to China to keep Pakistan, as Hussain Haqqani, eminent commentator, former Pakistan establishment man, and now persona non grata as far as Pakistan is concerned, and author of many books, had said, for China, Pakistan is a low-cost security deterrent to India, and for Pakistan, China is a high-value guarantor of security against India. Now, you don't give security guarantees sitting in Vladivostok and saying that you're going to bomb India. You give security guarantees also by a certain amount of commitment on the ground. Now, what is it that drives China's agenda on India? I wish they'd show the maps. I've been asking for the maps. Just show any map so that people are able to relate with why China is pushing for Pakistan to keep us distracted. And after that, I'll come to the other factors that are the international factors like jihadi groups and whatever else. But what is China's driving economic agenda to keep Pakistan and India at loggerheads?
See, Maruf, China, no doubt, is a very, very powerful economy today. Maybe a little bit of a downturn at the moment. But the fact remains that the entire Belt and Road initiative that it undertook under the One Road, the OROP program as such, the entire thing was contingent upon its flagship project, which was the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, into which it had sunk in $46 billion initially, $16 billion more, and subsequently promised to take it up to anything up to $90 billion. What was it getting at, actually? It was primarily the access. It was getting to the northwestern portion of the Indian Ocean, which is a very crucial area for China. That's the place from where 80% of the energy which China needs to sustain its high economic growth rate, that's where it comes from. And the securing of these sea routes, sea lines of communication was absolutely essential. It's important for China that Pakistan keeps India diverted while China is carrying out its various activities on the economic front. Most of the projects of the Belt and Road Initiative are essentially strategic in nature, but given under the garb of what is entirely economic. So, in many ways, Pakistan is the core center of this entire strategy, which revolves around the area of Central Asia, Afghanistan, Pakistan, primarily the area of the old great game, and now the area of the new great game, which is all about, you're aware of, infrastructure, pipelines, energy, and very largely ideology. So, to keep all its eggs in one basket, Pakistan is the one which provides all these drivers to China, and keeping India diverted, therefore. India diverted from its attention diverted from it always will add value to China's strategic capability.
Okay, so obviously Pakistan is the great distractor, but also Pakistan has been able to very successfully sell its narrative to countries other than China. For example, another part of the world where we have great economic interests, the Gulf region, where there's a huge amount of repatriation of funds that come into India. There is a large Indian population, in excess of 8 million Indians out there. And most importantly, the Gulf region is also Pakistan's go-to bailout friend other than China. Imran Khan's also currently making the rounds of some of those countries there. So there are hawks in India who might just feel happy that Pakistan's finally been limited to virtually one or no option. But I don't see that happening. I still see a lot of sympathy for Pakistan in the Gulf region. I see the possibility of also Pakistan, though failing to get a unanimous kind of verdict against India and what it has done in 370, and I must go on record to say my belief is we've done the right thing. But having done that, why is it that it is still managing to keep the subject alive outside its own foot soldiers on the streets?
Well, I think that has, as far as the Gulf is concerned, there is a certain, ideological connection that it has. And I think that the traditional historical relationship that it shares with the Gulf states allows it to sell its narrative even today. But I think it must be concluded that compared to where we were with the Gulf, say even 6 years back, today there has been a remarkable transformation. If you look at the official responses of the Gulf states to Indian decision, it has been quite remarkable. I mean, the fact that Saudis and the UAE so effectively have almost come to India's support on this issue. This is again officially. I think this is in some ways a victory for Mr. Modi himself, who has been very, very regular in terms of his outreach to the Gulf states. And I think he's still, again, going to Saudi Arabia very soon. So clearly, there is an incentive for Indian governments, and I think this has happened over the last few years, and there is an incentive for New Delhi to keep engaging the region, given, as you mentioned, our interests are so huge and so vast. And again, it must be pointed out that when you talk of the Indo-Pacific, India's version of the Indo-Pacific, which is often not talked about, is to the West. And we, as the Prime Minister told to the Shangri-La audience, that we are looking from the eastern shores of Africa to the western shores of the Pacific. So clearly, if you are looking at that geography, your interests in the Middle East, in the Gulf waters, are very, very profound, apart from the factors that you mentioned. And therefore, for India to be able to manage its diplomacy at such high levels there is very important, and I think it has paid dividends. Now, Pakistan, of course, has had this ideological relationship with the region. It has been able to sell that for a long time. But I must admit that I think that element is declining relatively. I don't see the kind of support that Pakistan used to get for everything that it used to say anti-India. That sentiment is no longer there. While certainly on Kashmir it will find some support in some quarters, I don't see the support today being as high as it used to be, and that's good news for India. But by and large, I think what we have seen globally over the last few weeks, in fact, Pakistan is feeling isolated. It is feeling isolated. And the fact that China took, I think what is important for me as an analyst of Sino-Pak relations is that China is now willing to bear certain diplomatic and political costs to defend Pakistan.
You actually brought me to my next question, and that's exactly it. What is the diplomatic and beyond diplomatic costs that the Chinese would be willing to bear in the event of Pakistan ratcheting up tensions and continuing to insist that, we have no choice but to take the military route? Now, just a bit of scenario making for the audience, that push comes to shove, Pakistan increases tensions on the line of control, India says, okay, we are not going to take it lying down, so we have other mechanisms to put into place. There's been talk of a cold start doctrine. That cold start doctrine has now been put aside, and then you have independent battle groups now. You have even a pivot movement, which General KJ has been talking about. So you have a whole lot of new military initiatives that are simultaneously coming into play just to make better use of our resources. So if I was a pacifist sitting in Washington, D.C., I would see alarm bells ringing in my office every other hour, thinking that, my God, what's next? But I want you to give a reality check on to what extent is all that true, because Jammu and Kashmir, interestingly, is the scenario from where you could look at the start of at least 3, if not 4 wars. One with Pakistan, one with China, one you're already fighting with the jihadis, and one all of this could use to the temptation at some stage that if you don't behave, I'll press the button.
Very, very interesting scenario that you built up, Maruf. But let me firstly flag this fact that when on the 5th of August, when both these constitutional provisions were abrogated, I don't think there could have been a better timing. Why do I say this? Primarily, Pakistan is economically down and out, and this is all about economics that we are talking here, is down and out. If you're looking for a $9 billion loan from the IMF and you get $6 billion thereafter, if you're going to Saudi Arabia for a $3 billion loan every 6 months, obviously you are not going to be in a position to fight a hot war, a regular conventional hot war. And therefore, I think this timing was perfect. A time when your adversary is weak, extremely weak, and particularly economically weak. It is bravado only which can make Pakistan fight. I don't think Pakistan can last more than 4 days economically if they have to fight a conventional war against India. And that's why they keep talking about the nuclear aspect, that we have got a nuclear weapon, and they keep threatening about nuclear weapons, etc. It's a sham. It's a big, a red rag which is there all the time to divert attention, right? Remember this, the world is no longer looking at regular conventional wars. Where have you seen the last regular conventional war being fought? You see Ukraine. There is a huge hybrid war going on in Ukraine at the moment. The word which you need to know today as intellectuals, as economic intellectuals, also is future wars are all hybrid, which means there will be low intensity, there will be an element of cyber in it. See what the Houthis have done to the Saudis, how they have hurt them with a swarm of drones. This is the kind of thing which you are going to suffer from tomorrow and day after. So China is willing to psychologically continue impinging on your mind that they will go the whole hog. Pakistan, that they are in sync with China, and that China is their best friend, higher than the skies, deeper than the oceans, that friendship is. I don't think all this really is as significant as the fact that both of them retain the capability to instigate, trigger hybrid wars, hybrid conflicts within your own territory. And you've got lots of things here in India which you need to be concerned about. You need to be concerned about the fault lines that you have all over in India. We need to cement those fault lines. You've got communal issues, you've got caste-based issues, all kinds of things which can be used. You're vulnerable, your economy is vulnerable to cyber attacks tomorrow. So all kinds of, these are the kinds of things which will manifest. But notwithstanding that, the threat of conventional war will continue to remain hanging over your heads, so that you are made to overreact, over-respond, commit larger resources of your defense economy to your overall strategic security requirements.
Okay, that's very comprehensively put, sir. Professor Harsh Pant, since you're a professor of war studies, and the War Studies Department has traditionally looked at conflicts from Napoleonic Wars to the World Wars, and now more recently, the new phenomena of low intensity and various other dimensions. I want you to explain to the audience that based on India's limited spending capacity, what is it that India should be focusing on without it eating into, it's very well for the military to turn around and say that, you know, everything on our wish list must be adhered to and provided with. But my view is that one of the reasons why we settled for 36 Rafale fighters is because to get 126 fighters in one go was not that easy for our pockets, amongst other things, and is a force multiplier. So what other force multipliers that we could be looking at in a scenario which will suit our pocket and secure our cities?
Maruf, this is, I think, the fundamental question for our national security strategy going forward. Because I think successive governments have made it very clear that budgets are going to be what they are. You can demand anything. Every time when the budgets are presented and before that the discussions happen, you have a plethora of demands, make it 3% of your GDP, your defense expenditure should be. But I think the ability of the present scenario is what it is. It will never allow you to reach that kind of the amount that many expect the governments to give, given what is happening. And this is not an Indian phenomenon. You look around the world today, all countries are investing in socio-economic realities of where they find. Defense is not a priority for most countries. In the sense, when you look at what your priorities should be. Now that doesn't mean that India should not be investing in defense or that we should not have a base. But I think the reality is that whichever government you can vote for, it can be very nationalistic or it can be less nationalistic. The realities of the economy are going to be the most important determining factor in how much they're going to give to the defense forces to spend. And I think therefore defense forces will have to be more agile in using whatever little they are getting. And in that sense, what we are now looking at is, as you said, some force multipliers, looking at asymmetric advantages where you can get them. And I think in particular this applies very, very significantly when you look at the Chinese. And you look at the Chinese model, how they had taken on the Americans. If you look at the maritime strategy of the Chinese, it's entirely reliant on asymmetric technologies. They are not saying they are going to go one-on-one with you, dollar for dollar, equipment per equipment. I think what they are telling the Americans that we have enough capabilities to now disproportionately impact you so that you won't even think of coming into even Taiwan straits. So I think that's the reality that Chinese have built around themselves, and that's how we should be also thinking given the economic realities that we face and given the challenges that we face. Also, I think it is incredibly important for when you look at defense modernization and what we are doing, where we are spending. Cutting the flap, for example, has been one of the issues in defense modernization for a long time. How far, how effective we have been. And again, we often bring, when it comes to China, we often compare us to the Chinese. But I think defense reforms is one area where we really need to be looking hard at how Chinese have been able to accomplish so much in such a short amount of time. And I think without those kind of fundamental reforms, we will never get the kind of impact, the kind of resilience that we need in our armies, in our military today, to deal with the kind of challenges we face. Because as I think General Hasnain pointed out, you're not going to have a conventional war anytime soon. What you're going to have is these hybrid kind of wars where all the assets that you have would be on the play. And how you use them effectively. And I think certain areas, for example, information technology, cyber, is an advantage. We are world's, apparently, the #1 IT power in the world. But have we leveraged it in our defense capabilities? I don't think so we have.
Yeah, I mean, you've covered a lot of ground, and I wanted you to bring that out because, I mean, there's another myth we really need to put to rest, and that is that we are an IT superpower, because actually we're just very good backroom workers. But quite clearly, we have the capability, and I've suggested to the armed forces that you should set up geek brigades. Guys with long hair, beards, etc., hammering out solutions, knocking off all sorts of cyber walls that exist in the enemy's domain. And if they get difficult with you, they say, okay, do you know that Lahore's dams could be breached in an hour's time and your city could be flooded? Go back and do a little homework. And then we'll talk about whether we'll use the nuclear bomb at all or not. I mean, there are things that can be done. It is being done, and the Chinese in our region at least are masters at it. I still have reason to believe that some of our aircrafts that disappeared in the northeast were decapacitated because of cyber attacks. And the Russians have done cyber attacks on American ships in the Black Sea. So if you're an IT superpower, then you better show it. But General Saab, let me ask you another problem, which is, you mentioned a bit about it, but I want you to elaborate further with reference to Kashmir and its spillover effect in the rest of India, because this is something that no country, no prosperous economy can gamble with. And that is the rise of a whole lot of hardline elements. Kashmir has very systematically, under our very noses, become from an eclectic Sufi society into now pretty much a hotbed, at least in South Kashmir, of jihadis and their lackeys. What is the possibility of some of that being hounded out of Kashmir and ending up in other parts of North India? After all, the Maulanas who went to Kashmir to brainwash them, they were picked up from madrasas elsewhere in India. And many Maulanas still tend to go to Saudi Arabia for regular pilgrimage. And I wouldn't be surprised that out of 120,000 on an average a year that goes, 20,000 could be brainwashed.
Maruf, we were slow in taking off, in understanding, perceiving, and recognizing the power of radicalism, faith-based radicalism acting against us, against our interests, starting from Kashmir itself. How it happened in over 20, 25 years, as you said, right under our noses, was because we really had little idea about hybrid war. And we did not really appreciate what role radicalism can play in hybrid war. Mercifully, today that understanding has come, our strategic culture has improved to a great extent. And now the only thing we are wrestling with at the moment is how to counter this, how to de-radicalize. And although we have programs going on, but I don't think they are sufficient to be able to address the issue. The fact that you brought out the possibility of all this coming out from Kashmir into portions of North India, well, we've experienced it before. We've experienced the Mumbai issue, problems in Mumbai. We've experienced it in other cities. And what we really should be concerned about is southern India today. What happened in Sri Lanka on the 18th of April this year was a manifestation of actually the efforts which were going on all over southern India. Radicalism thrives on networks, and the ISIS has shown us how networks can really be created and made to thrive. The manner in which the ISIS managed to draw, how many, 40,000 fighters from all over the world to its ranks was something amazing. So I think in India, we need to now understand that, first of all, fighting hybrid war is not just the business of the army, nor is it just the business of the police. It is the business of everyone who's sitting here. Because that war is against you. That war is against your economy. The war is against your social stability. The war is against your academic institutions. Everything to create divisions within you, to weaken your structure. The only answer to that lies in what is always called the whole of government approach, the whole of society approach. Every man here sitting here is a warrior for India. And that's the lesson which you should be going away from here.
Okay, well, very motivating, I suppose. It would have charged up sentiments, at least at some levels. But Professor Pant, probably this, if it's a 30-minute show, then this is the last question that we have. And that is that I read a very interesting piece which said that after the drone attack on the Saudi refineries, there is a need to revisit doctrines. There is a need to re-understand that what is it that will provide you real security? Would it be another batch of fighter jets, or would it be unmanned drones? Would it be air defense systems, or more soldiers better equipped to battle people in the jungles? So briefly, just enlighten us that where would your biases lie?
Well, I think I still think that most of our defense acquisition is happening on a very ad hoc basis. So that's a fundamental problem. If you don't think in a decade or 2 decades time frame, then I think the whole point, because technology is evolving so fast, the whole point of these acquisitions become almost redundant. And therefore, when you are looking at technology today, and how do you integrate that technology in your defense services, I think that's a fundamental question that any military today should be asking, and including the Indian military. How do you make them integrated into your doctrines, into your strategic behavior? Because ultimately, that is going to give you bang for the buck. You're not going, every single fighter aircraft is not going to be the one that is going to achieve results for you. And here you are looking at the reality where operational and strategic environment for India is rapidly evolving. So how do you then think in long term? And I think that remains a fundamental vulnerability. And I think, and I think that that's changing. We know that perhaps A national security strategy is being talked about, it's in the making. We have talked about it for so long. We have been talking about CDS for so long. We still have no clarity on it. At least the announcement has been made. So I think there have been baby steps in a direction where long-term strategic thinking gets more institutionalized in the country. But I think until that happens, the ad hocism that I think has been the bane of Indian defense policy will not do us good, which I think, and I think that changing mindset is the need of the hour.
Yeah, I mean, well, I see we're out of time, and I can only sum up to say that this government, unlike other governments in the past, seems to have now finally a plan in place that it is probably implementing without much fanfare. And as yet, post 2 months after the removal of 370, I think the steps that have been taken keeping in mind the earlier mistakes that had happened and to prevent those from happening. But having said that, I think there needs to be far greater national security engagement between the pundits like yourself and the industry which is sitting here. And of course, the media needs to understand that there is more to life than Kashmir and Pakistan. But on that note, I'd say thank you to both. And I don't know if you have to ask any questions or is it over? Well, thank you very much for being with us. And the rest, I leave it now to the anchors.